Good afternoon. Welcome to Rage Against the Machine Learning. My name is Andrew Liptak. I'm the weekend editor for The Verge, which is a tech and culture website. I will be moderating today, and this panel will be on the record. So let me just introduce my panelists first. Go ahead. I did introduce myself. I'm Andrew Liptak from The Verge. All right. We'll start with Elsa. Kania is an adjunct fellow at with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. Her research on Chinese military innovation in emerging technologies contributes to the Artificial Intelligence and Global Security Initiative at CNAS.
I'm happy to jump in.
Okay.
Cool. Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Hwang. Very excited to be here. I am currently director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance of AI Initiative, which is a kind of joint research project and philanthropic fund in the AI space. Formerly, I was head of global public policy for Google on AI and machine learning, working with various policymakers and trying to figure out what are rules that should apply around the technology. And actually, with some of the discussions today, I also come at some of these issues from a different direction. Since 2009, I've been sort of a bot maker online, so launching bots to manipulate sort of discussion on social media platforms. And more recently, I've been working on a paper on sort of the strategy of information warfare for the Office of Net Assessment.
And unfortunately, Michael Horowitz was not able to make it, so Paul Scharre is filling in. If you'd like to reintroduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Paul Scharre from the Center for New American Security.
Okay. Would you like to get started?
Sure. So I've been trying to think about artificial intelligence and the future of strategic competition from the perspective of someone who's looked primarily at China and the Chinese military. And I think one of the major debates that has been salient these days has been the notion of great power rivalry in artificial intelligence, or even the notion of an AI arms race between the US and China. So I thought I would start off with trying to deconstruct that particular debate, because I think it is a very prevalent, but in many respects inadequate, perhaps incomplete framing of a much more complex dynamic today. And I'd say when we're thinking about the impact of artificial intelligence, if I might broaden the scope of discussion beyond warfare, I think the primary impact as Chinese leaders see it today is that AI is a strategic technology that could enable China to seize the lead in a new round of scientific and technological competition, particularly through enhancing China's economic competitiveness. And we've been talking today a lot about ways in which these technologies might disrupt the American way of warfare. But I think when we're looking at this from the perspective of today's great power rivalry, it is clear that Chinese leaders are thinking first and foremost about ways that AI can enhance the economic dimension of their national power going forward. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, particularly as we're thinking about competitive strategy and how to target investments going forward, that at the end of the day, the outcome of this great power rivalry will be determined first and foremost by some of these economic factors going forward. When we talk about a race, I think we also haven't quite answered the question of what is our desired destination in this context? And what are we aiming for when we think about AI in military affairs? We've mentioned over the course of the day a range of potential applications, some of which are overhyped, some of which are perhaps underappreciated at present, again, from autonomous weapons to the use of AI in intelligence or even supporting logistics. I think when we start to think about how AI could perhaps transform the future military balance, we have to grapple with the reality that we don't even understand at this point, I would argue, what the right metrics are to think about how this might evolve going forward, because many of the ways in which AI could prove impactful can be almost imperceptible. That even if Chinese military may like to demonstrate some of their advances in swarming and make the point that they've beat the US record or set a new world record for the number of drones in their swarm, that is not necessarily a good indicator of the actual sophistication of their advances in this element of autonomy, though clearly it is something that the Chinese military sees as quite relevant and a major focus going forward. But I think at this point we're still grappling about the best way to think about which applications and which dimensions of military power could be transformed by AI, and if this is a competition, which states have an advantage? Are the US and China destined to be AI superpowers, as Kai-Fu Lee, among others, have started to argue, or could, as our colleague Dr. Horowitz, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, has posited, perhaps smaller states might actually have an advantage because these technologies can lower the barriers to entry and can decouple military power from more traditional metrics like population. So we may see greater opportunities for non-state actors, including corporations, since commercial technologies are driving a lot of these advances. And yeah, and even though I primarily have looked at how the Chinese military is thinking about AI, I'm honestly more concerned about what non-state actors might do with Chinese technologies that are being developed and exported, as we've seen so far with combat drones, and could see increasingly with AI-enabled products going forward. And when we think about great power rivalry as well, another dimension I want to bring into the conversation that's been a theme throughout the day is issues of political economy, and particularly the role of tech companies in enhancing this dimension of capability going forward. And that's another place where you see some major asymmetries between the US and China at present. And certainly tech companies are driving developments in both countries. China's national strategy for AI has really sought to harness the capabilities of its tech companies and brand them as national champions and leverage them to advance China's development, but also looking to advance a national strategy of military-civil fusion that seeks to, in some cases, building upon lessons learned from the successes of the American defense innovation ecosystem, that seeks now, in the case of China, to advance deeper synergies among academic, defense, and commercial developments, including through mobilizing some of China's leading companies like Baidu and leading universities like Tsinghua for the development of AI for military purposes. So I think a question that we do have to grapple with going forward is how best to optimize these sorts of public-private partnerships that we need in an American context, and how to grapple with these challenges of, and back to the theme of debating, of how to think about ethics in a forward-leaning way when some of these conversations on ethical issues might look quite different in a Chinese context. Yeah, and I think looking forward, when we're thinking about debating which of these states could have an advantage in this realm going forward, it is not a zero-sum game, and it's never going to be clear who is winning per se, because again, AI is not a singular technology, but it encompasses a range of techniques and applications, and I think it's not clear to me that either side will ever have a clear or enduring advantage, which I think does challenge when we think about the American way of warfare and the reality in recent history that there has been a clear edge and overmatch that we've enjoyed. I'm not sure if we can assume that we will have that in the future. I think there is a real possibility that China could emerge as a leader and pioneer in future ways of warfare, or at least their military clearly aspires to do so, and Xi Jinping has highlighted a national strategy of innovation-driven development as an imperative in terms of both reconciling or accelerating economic growth at a time of slowdown that's seen as a threat to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party leadership, but also in advancing military innovation and trying to take advantage of what Chinese military leaders see as an advancing revolution in military affairs, in which, from their perspective, China has a unique opportunity, given that the playing field in these technologies is already much more level than it has been in the past. There's an opportunity for the Chinese military to start to advance innovation, not only in these technologies and capabilities, but also through exploring new concepts and new approaches to training and organization going forward. So again, I think we should not overhype what China has accomplished, even though I think it is worth pointing out that by many metrics, including the numbers of publications and patents, China is already #1 in AI in the world. Again, what is AI? Are we looking at particular applications like facial recognition, where China has a clear edge because they can have massive amounts of images of faces given to private companies and tech startups that have become part of this massive surveillance government complex? But certainly if we do look at more cutting edge research and next generation applications, the US still does have a clear lead. So it's never going to be, I think, a clear cut competition here, to the extent that it is a competition, and it's also even more complicated by virtue of the fact that the US and China are also deeply entangled, so to speak, or deeply interdependent in terms of advancing innovation in these technologies. So I think the policy relevant debate that's most salient at present, I would say, is how do we push back against some of the tactics of tech transfer that China has undertaken through legal and illegal means, including sometimes exploiting academic partnerships or commercial engagements to gain access to dual-use technologies. But how do we, at the same time, continue to maintain what I'd argue is the U.S. Core advantage in our American way of innovation, so to speak, that is our openness, our inclusivity, and continuing to welcome talent from around the world. So I think going forward, it'll be fascinating to see how this plays out. I'm looking forward to continuing the debate.
Great. Yeah, so happy to jump in. Let me take a step back and come at maybe this problem or this panel from another direction, which is to ask a pretty simple question, right? Which is, how do we project the future impact of AI on warfare? And I think there's a tendency to think about AI as just sort of one thing that gets applied in many different contexts, right? So we ask questions like, who will win the AI arms race? Or we say, how will AI change the nature of war? And, I think ultimately this sort of fundamentally misunderstands what's happening in the world of artificial intelligence. That in fact, machine learning, right, this key technology, which is a subfield of AI that has really seen the great deal of development in the last few years, is really a set of tools rather than a weapon sort of in of itself. And ultimately, it's just sort of the art, the practice of creating algorithms that get better with data. And so I think to respond to the question of how do we understand the future impact of AI on warfare, we end up having to get a lot more specific. I think it's much better to ask, what problem are we interested in having machine learning solve? So, for example, object recognition, right? The ability to make machines be able to successfully recognize objects and images, right? That is a very specific application of AI. And it suddenly, I think, makes a lot of our discussions a lot more concrete, right? Rather than asking, who will win the AI arms race, right? We can start to say, sort of, who will win the AI arms race sort of in the context of image recognition or object recognition. Instead of saying, how will AI change the nature of war, we can say, how will advances in image recognition change the nature of war? And, in some ways that is a little bit of one framing that is, in some ways, a sleight of hand, right? Because the next question is then, okay, so which uses are the ones that are going to be most likely to occur in the future? And, certainly one framework that I bring to some of these discussions is to think a little bit not just about sort of AI, the kind of complete product at the end, but instead to think about inputs, right? What are the actual things that you need to pull off sort of modern day machine learning? And it turns out that machine learning is still actually kind of this quite specific tool, this quite brittle tool, and you need sort of a set of components to really pull it off. And some of these will be familiar, right? So people say you need data, right, of course, to do machine learning. You need computing power, you need sort of talent to actually pull this off. A wonkier one is sort of you need learning architectures, right? You need sort of the code that allows the algorithm to get smarter with better data. And I think one way of thinking about where AI is going to have an impact is where those resources are most accessible or most costless or cheap to access, right? One of the reasons that image recognition has been sort of an early application of AI that has seen so much progress is because the companies are holding a lot of the resources they need to pull off this particular task. And so I think that's a framework for thinking about how we size up and divide up this space into something that's more workable than simply asking the question of who wins the AI arms race. Maybe a final coda, which I'd love to get into, is so far the practice of doing modern day machine learning has been a very resource intensive process. But I think one of the things that we're seeing in the space, which I think is really quite interesting, is that increasingly a lot of the kind of components, the inputs that you need for machine learning are increasingly becoming commoditized. Right? And so I think we're moving from a world where you needed, a room of PhDs working on this, a huge amount of data and a huge amount of computing power, to a world where, a lot of the basics are quite commoditized. It will be easy for anyone with a basic sort of command of computer science to implement these tools. And I think that really changes the strategic landscape of how we think about not just international competition in the space, but even kind of domestically how we want to arrange sort of questions of innovation. And so I think with that, let me just quickly pause, but just as a framework to bring to some of this.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, I'm going to start, because it's late and people are tired, I'm going to start with some foul language, because if I can't do that in the Army, I don't know when I can. So I work, in my job at CNAS, I run our technology and national security program. And one of my jobs is to sort of look at different technologies that people are talking about in the defense space, try to figure out what's real and what's not. And I will say right up front, there's a lot of bullshit in this space, like a lot. There's a lot of talk about hypersonics and directed energy and quantum computing and blah 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 blah. And you look at all this stuff and you're like, how do you use any of this stuff to guide a coherent investment strategy for the United States or its allied nations? If you believed everything people were saying, everything's a game changer and everything's revolutionary, we'd invest in everything, and that can't possibly be true. They're not all equally valuable. So I will say, like, there is a lot of nonsense out there. I don't think that what we're talking about in AI is one of those things. I was at a talk last week, I was talking about AI, and someone asked, like, well, when is AI going to become real? When are we going to start seeing this, like, deep learning, like, actually have real commercial impact? The answer is 2 years ago. It's already happening. Because of, as Tim mentioned, an explosion in machine learning over the past 5 to 6 years, particularly deep learning, we've already seen companies take this technology and use it to, in the case of Google, increase efficiency in their data centers, energy efficiency by 40%. Facebook using facial recognition systems online. Facebook using now not just machine learning, but a technique called reinforcement learning on their notifications that they give people. You can get a keyless entry system for your door. You could buy this, put it on your house, uses facial recognition to identify you when you come into your house. So there are aspects of this machine learning, the pieces of it, that are already becoming commoditized and becoming real. It's not something in the future. The technology is going to continue to evolve, but it is real today. And by one estimate by McKinsey, the technology that's possible, if it were to sort of be, be used across the U.S. economy, could automate roughly half of all tasks being done in the U.S. economy today. That's a tremendous. Now that's not jobs. It's maybe less than 5% of jobs can be completely eliminated. But half of all things being done that are productivity related could be automated. That's a tremendous amount of change that's possible over the next several decades as this technology that's already real then diffuses out into various industries. So how do we make sense of this? How do we harness this technology in the military space? One way, of course, is to look at these specific instances. You've got facial recognition technology, you've got translation functions, you've got things like object identification. How do I use each of these for military purposes? In the big picture, what is this like? That's a lot of discussions about AI. You hear that like data is like oil and AI is like electricity and all these other things, right? And like in the AI space, people just like their heads explode because of course artificial intelligence is none of those things. It's its own technology. It's not totally, I think, a terrible analogy to come at the problem because some of these are general purpose kinds of technologies. The best example that I could think of would be thinking of what's happening with artificial intelligence as a process of cognitization that is analogous to the broad process of mechanization that happened during the Industrial Revolution, where a suite of technologies allowed people to create special purpose machines that were stronger than humans for various tasks. There was no general all-purpose machine that did everything. You create various machines, you create locomotives and automobiles and assembly line factories and other things to perform various kinds of tasks. And similarly, we're able to now create purpose-built machines that can perform particular tasks that are smarter than humans, or at least equal to in some valuable and useful way. And we're seeing these already being used in, for example, cybersecurity, where the winner of DARPA's Cyber Grant Challenge that was looking for vulnerabilities in computers and then finding them automatically and patching them has been hired by DoD to help work on improving DoD networks. So the two things that interest me when we think about use of this is that there seems to be these twin features of the technology today that are particularly problematic in the security space. One is that if used the right way, if we can get it to work, and the technology can be a little bit finicky, but when it works, it can be very powerful and can not only solve problems at the same way that, in useful ways, can do tasks that people could do, and then you can automate them at scale in a low-cost way, but in some cases can do things better than humans. Come up with creative solutions to problems that are quite interesting and valuable. But then the other feature of this is that there are a lot of safety concerns surrounding the technology. It tends to be very brittle. If the context for its use changes, it can perform very, very poorly. We're seeing this already with things like self-driving cars, having accidents, that they may perform great in some settings and in other settings quite poorly. And this is, this sort of element of brittleness is certainly not unique to cars. We see it across these kinds of technologies. In the military space, this term safety may not translate very well from what people are saying in the AI field to what we might think of in the defense and security space. When we say safety in the Army, we tend to think about things like PT belts and Nomex gloves and like little, protective lenses. A better example, a better term might be vulnerabilities. That these technologies, very powerful, there's many vulnerabilities. I hear some people say things like, well, then we wouldn't use it. And I would say I don't think that's true. We use computers and we use networks, and they have tremendous vulnerabilities, but they're also powerful. We've integrated them across our entire force, and now we are, after the fact, trying to bake in security. It's very, very hard to do. And I would suggest that we want to do differently with these systems because they have similar vulnerabilities, can work at the cognitive level, where the systems could learn the wrong thing. They could have data poisoned, manipulated by others. People could find sort of blind spots in the way that they think and manipulate them. To give just two examples that I particularly like, one is an example of a failure mode in a learning system called reward hacking, where a system does what it is told to do, but it is not what you really meant, what you intended. And one example of this is a fellow who trained a bot to play old Nintendo games. And it was not very good. It was some good at some games, not very good at others. One of the games that was terrible at was Tetris, because you didn't get good feedback in Tetris until you clear a line, so it was very bad, just stacking the bricks up. But one of the things that was quite clever was it learned right before the last brick fell to push the start button and pause the game. So I would never lose. And I love that. It's the kind of thing my 5-year-old would do. And from the perspective of the AI system, totally allowable. That was an allowable move to make. And that kind of inability to understand context and intent can be exploited by others. There's an incident a few years ago where Microsoft put a bot out on Twitter that was a learning bot. I don't know why you would do this. Twitter is a terrible, terrible place. But in any case, they put this thing out. It was learning from human interactions on Twitter. Within 24 hours, of course, it's spouting this like hateful, racist, anti-Semitic propaganda. And it's like, wasn't Hitler great? And they had to take it offline. But these are the kinds of very serious problems, and some of them are easily addressable and some of them are not. And so as we begin to incorporate this technology into our military, I think we want to be very cognizant of these vulnerabilities and begin thinking about security upfront.
I want to jump off from that point and just try to tie things back to the modern day and back to the ethics part of this panel. As we've talked about how powerful, widespread, and accessible some of these systems have become, how do we try to bake in some protections to prevent bad actors from using them and misusing them, especially as they become more and more powerful? I don't know who wants to start, but.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So, one of the big, I would say, security vulnerability questions in machine learning is something you may have heard of, which is adversarial examples. So, as I mentioned before, right, one of the big uses of machine learning currently is just image recognition. And it turns out that there are small things that you can do. You can change a few pixels to an image to cause the system to completely misrecognize what that object is. So the famous example is you take a picture of a panda and you can make the system basically believe that it's anything else other than a panda. And there's currently a lot of technical research going in right now to trying to figure out how do we secure some of these systems against attack. And I think part of the challenge is that that actually from a mathematical standpoint, there's some question as to whether or not you can ever conclusively protect them. And in fact, the only way we really know currently to protect them is know where the vulnerability is and then train it using examples of the thing that fooled it in the past. And that suggests a really kind of tricky thing, which is that there's sort of a technical ceiling after which we're not able to give certain types of guarantees. And I think it's true of a lot of kind of questions around machine learning in general, because it's not just that it's a new version of computer science, that actually the paradigm of programming is actually a little bit different. So some of the kind of verification and robustness techniques we've brought to these problems in the past no longer really apply, right? And may be a source of persistent vulnerability.
I'm thinking even on even a business or organizational level, when you design a product, what types of thinking has to go into something in order to maybe see through and recognize where it can be misused?
I'd say first approximation, simply an awareness that these vulnerabilities exist and that there are malicious actors out there who may have an incentive to exploit them, whether for criminal, terrorist purposes or in a military context as well. I mean, I think the the prevalence of adversarial examples and opportunities to exploit algorithms that seem to be quite pervasive do raise the question of, put this more in a security parlance, if this is a domain, so to speak, that's offense dominant and that it's much easier to exploit these systems than to secure them, then what are the implications of that when we're thinking about potentially starting to field and deploy algorithms, including in very sensitive contexts? So I think definitely an awareness and a sort of preemptively thinking through the ramifications of some of these vulnerabilities, and I think we can learn a lot of lessons from the failure to do so in cybersecurity, given that these vulnerabilities have become essentially flaws by design that have been quite difficult to mitigate since. And I think I'd also add that I mean, whether it's interesting to compare the approach that the Chinese government is starting to take to thinking in quite a forward-leaning way about approaches to introducing new standards and regulations, including with a recent fairly authoritative white paper on AI safety and security that takes a quite comprehensive approach through thinking about the range of risks and challenges that can arise with AI. And I think it's also does raise this question of, is this something that where the private sector can take a leading role in sort of developing their own norms and standards for securing these technologies, or will there be a role for governments to take on a more active involvement in trying to think about setting standards and parameters for development, and even are there opportunities for US-China cooperation on some of these issues, given that a lot of these products could create shared risks going forward?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how do you keep this out of the hands of bad actors, or how do you respond to what they might do, I think you can attack the problem in different ways. One thing that I think is not going to work is trying to actually restrict access to the technology. It's just too ubiquitous. Now, there's only a handful, when you look at sort of like most cutting edge advances in AI, there's only a handful of actors that are actually doing those things because they require large amounts of computing power and data sets. But then once algorithms are trained, the amount of computing power needed is much less, and the technology proliferates quite quickly. So what might have been, only a few labs could do it 3 or 4 years ago, within a couple years, maybe a postdoc could do it, or maybe in a few years from now, an undergrad could do it. In researching my recent book, I tried to figure out how hard it would be for someone to build an autonomous weapon that could go around and like kill people on their own. It is terrifyingly possible. I found, within a few minutes online, I'm not a programmer, but a few minutes online, a trained neural network that you could download that identifies humans as a class that you could use to put on some kind of platform, a drone or something else. So all the technology, I think, is going to be out there, unfortunately. But there are ways we can tackle the problem. The amount of money that's invested in AI safety versus advancing AI capability is probably really out of whack compared to the challenge today. So more investments in safety would probably help. In terms of our own systems, I do think we probably need to think harder about how we make our systems secure, and that things like red teaming should be baked into our acquisition system. That like making sure that we met the requirements document is not going to be enough to make our system safe. That we've got to like dynamic red teams against the problem, and then make sure that operators are well trained on what the actual vulnerabilities are. And then in the commercial marketplace, like there's going to be a need for regulation on different aspects of this. It's hard for me to imagine how you would regulate like AI as a whole. It's too many different things. But if we have regulations, in many states that require, for example, two-party consent for audio recording, that's a pretty benign technology compared to a lot of things that AI can do. You think about, say, facial recognition technology or other things, there's probably a role for regulation in a lot of that as well.
It strikes me that there's a point where we have systems in operation right now, either online on Twitter or Facebook, that can sort of shape public perception on a global scale, and we've seen this deployed against the United States and in other places around the world. How do you see good actors sort of protecting against these types of systems as they're deployed? They have to recognize them and then figure out how to stop them, or at least counter them.
I guess, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm afraid I can imagine more dark scenarios than positive solutions right now, but I think I worry sometimes that at some point what we saw in 2016 will look very trivial relative to some of the challenges that could be coming down the pipeline in terms of deepfakes, even shallow fakes, or much more realistic generation of imagery, video, and other forms of content that could be quite convincing. I believe there's some efforts underway to start to explore, ways to detect some of these small giveaways that still persist. And for instance, I think eye motion of humans in videos that are deep fakes is not realistic relative to actual human gestures or human idiosyncrasies, so there may still be ways to test and verify and perhaps to use AI to detect some of the minute differences between fake and real content, and perhaps other ways to have watermarks or other means of differentiating a valid content. But I think this does also get back to the broader question of sort of that belief and truth, and how can we start to perhaps re-engineer our information ecosystem to be more resilient across the board, because I think technical solutions will be important, but a lot of this does come back to the societal and institutional challenges that we were discussing earlier in the day, and I think solutions there will be much longer term.
Yeah, maybe to take a small piece of that problem, as a kind of practitioner of bot creation, I think the impact of machine learning in the use of bots for disinformation will have a really interesting impact, because I think it changes the fundamental economics of sort of disinformation campaigns. So in the past, when you've launched bots, there's this trade-off, if you have a fixed budget, between sort of scope and depth, right? Like I can launch a large number of bots, but they can be sort of really simple and rudimentary, and if you dig deep enough, it becomes obvious that they are bots. Or I can basically have a smaller number of accounts that are all driven by humans. It's a lot more expensive, but that's kind of the trade-off that you run into. What's interesting with some of the advances in machine learning is advances in what they call sequence-to-sequence learning, right? Which in practice enables bots to engage in more believable conversations over time. And so there's the idea that what machine learning might do, at least in the bot space, is allow you to get the best of both worlds, right? That you can not only launch a large number of accounts, but that they can be persuasive and believable at scale as well. That has interesting implications, for example, our ability to detect who is behind the campaign, right? Because you also need a relatively smaller number of people to actually engage in this kind of work. Whereas in the past, you might need a whole room of trolls working for you. Now it's a lot more possible for a smaller team to run a much larger number of believable personas. And so there's these kind of interesting impacts even on this like very specific level outside of the more exotic kind of deepfake stuff that we've been seeing.
Given that we don't have the overhyped robotic humanoids that are in the world right now, you also have to have people who are willing to sort of go along with what the bots are doing, and they're either directed or misdirected into doing things that they might not otherwise do on their own.
That's right. I think one of the most interesting and advanced AI systems that we have right now are systems that command attention, right? So it turns out that the Facebook newsfeed, right, is ultimately a machine learning system that is optimized to ensure that you stay on the platform, right? Yep. And it turns out that some of the same dynamics that Paul was talking about actually play out here as well, right? Which is, it was very expensive for Facebook to develop those human behavioral models, right? But once trained, you have a predictive model that if it's leaked, stolen, exfiltrated, right? Suddenly, that's a technique and a technology that can be used to execute sort of other persuasive campaigns. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing that we have yet to see.
Sure.
And this dynamic that Tim walked through with the bots, it pertains to other areas. Once you reach sort of this threshold of machine capability, where it starts to get sort of near the human level to be relevant, because of the lower cost of replicating them, you start to see this dynamic. Some researchers were able to demonstrate this a couple of years ago with automated spearfishing. So it used to be with phishing emails. You could send out lots of phishing emails to get people to click on links. In an automated fashion, or you could tailor emails to some individuals, these spearfishing emails that you research them and their life, and you can create an email that they're more likely to click on. And they're able to do this in an automated fashion, create tailored emails to individuals by using algorithms and bots to mine information on social media and get reasonably high click-through rates. So it's in a lot of other areas. There was a paper a couple of years, maybe a year ago, I guess now, by 26 different authors from 14 different institutions on malicious uses of AI. It's a really interesting paper. If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. And there was a debate in writing it among several of the authors about this sort of question of offense-defense balance. And the paper ends up being sort of agnostic on it. My take would be that I would say whoever wins is whoever can adapt faster, because the technology is moving so quickly that the speed of adaptation will be actually the most significant factor in being able to harness this.
Yeah, and it strikes me also that, I mean, in the social data space specifically, I think it points out a really important distinction to make. So, there's these comments, right? Like data is the new oil, right? And the tendency to think about like all data as if it were just like this commodity, right? Like this like black stuff that you put in barrels and ship one location to another. But there is a really interesting distinction between social data and the machine learning you can train on social data versus the data of physical systems and the machine learning systems that you can train on top of that, right? So it's a little abstract, so let me make that more concrete. So imagine you need to teach a robot arm to pick up an object, right? The machine learning person would say, okay, what you need is lots and lots of robot arms that try to pick up objects all the day, and then they eventually figure it out, right? Like they use that physical data. One of the new techniques that are being tried by OpenAI and a number of other labs is to try simulation learning, right? The notion is, okay, rather than have all these physical arms, let's put them all into simulation, have them try that multiple times. And so what they can effectively do is generate synthetic data, right? You don't actually have to go through the cost, and even if you don't have access to these robot arms, you can still maybe do a pretty good job training these things. That means that it's possible for you to create synthetic data and train AI systems that command sort of these physical robots, right? But it suddenly gets a lot more difficult if you're saying, okay, so how do we create a machine learning model that makes it better for us to predict who's going to be persuaded by this messaging, right? It's really difficult for us to create a simulation or even access that social data very cheaply. And so it actually puts a cap on adversaries that might want to engage in that, right? And so sort of the end result is that kind of not all data is made equal, and that actually has a big impact on the strategic landscape that different actors face when they're trying to get access to these capabilities.
Just add that the notion that China is the new Saudi Arabia because China will have, by some accounts, 30% of the world's data by 2030, that assumption does start to break down when you look at some of these interesting applications of synthetic data and ways in which it may be more relevant in some cases than real-world data. So I do think that sort of breaking down these notions that all data is created equal is important, especially given that, for Chinese tech companies, they have very rich data on the day-to-day lives of their Chinese customers, particularly because there's so much happening on mobile and so much via apps that have become quite pervasive in daily life. But at the same time, Chinese tech companies don't have access to more diverse data from a broader range of countries and contexts. And a lot of this data generated for commercial applications will have very limited relevance when we start to think about some of the more specific military applications of AI that will be impactful going forward. So the use of synthetic data, generative adversarial networks, and the introduction of simulations for training, I think, will be more and more important as we think about some of these more exquisite contexts and applications in the future.
I want to shift over to a little bit like going over to the real world and physical battlefield. How do you see machine learning playing a larger role in actual operations elsewhere in the world, in the real world, not simulated or on Facebook or whatever?
Hard to know where to start because I think the potential range of applications is only limited by imagination and the capability of organizations to adapt and start to implement. I think to start from some of what seems to be a focus for the Chinese military at present in their research, development, and experimentation includes quite a few applications that are not unlike those the US is focused on. So for instance, ways in which AI can enhance intelligence from data fusion to acoustic signal processing on submarines to potential early warning in support of nuclear capabilities, context of information operations, potential for greater automation for cyber warfare, new frontiers like cognitive electronic warfare to try to seize dominance in the spectrum, plus potentially, apropos of our conversation about manipulation, new opportunities in psychological warfare, or what the Chinese military refers to as political work, both defensively, in terms of trying to ensure the integrity of their own personnel, and more offensively, perhaps as well, plus quite a range of unmanned systems across all domains that could become more autonomous. For the Chinese Navy, unmanned surface vessels and particularly autonomous underwater vehicles are a major focus there. Given that the PLA does not have actual combat experience in recent history, at least not since its 1979 war with Vietnam, the use of AI in things like wargaming and for more realistic training is a priority as well. And of course, given our conversation about AlphaGo earlier in the day, I think it's notable that for PLA strategists, that case demonstrated to them that AI could have potentially great impact in terms of thinking about the future of command decision making and use of AI for decision support and battle management is something seems to be quite an active focus of development and experimentation, and could be impactful in the future as well. Plus many more that I'm sure leave to my colleagues to continue to discuss and debate. But
I mean, I have a question for Elsa, actually, Andrew, if I don't mind me jumping in. I'm interested by this point you're bringing up around sort of Chinese data being really good for training AI systems that apply to like contexts that are similar to China. Do you think that is going to be actually end up being a strategic difference, I guess, between China and the US and some of this stuff? That is to say, China has access to a lot of deep data about sort of the Chinese landscape, Chinese people, Chinese culture, and that's really good for training these systems that are kind of specific to their context. You could make the argument that since, say, American companies have you know, this global data on populations, right, or you know, data that actually is more widespread, right, that you actually may be able to train you may be able to train AI systems that are more applicable from a cross-cultural point of view. I don't know if you'd agree with that argument.
yeah, I think that does seem to be part of the reason why, for instance, under the aegis of China's One Belt, One Road strategy, the Digital Silk Road piece of that is focused on a going out of Chinese tech companies to set up big data centers, become involved in smart city projects, contribute to the development of information infrastructure, like in 5G, and often these sorts of activities do involve seeking access to data abroad, including through agreements focused on cooperation in AI development that could be beneficial for the countries involved, but also could be beneficial for Chinese tech companies that are seeking out greater diversity, so to speak, in terms of access to data. And I think we could see perhaps, I mean, there's been a lot of talk of an AI Cold War lately, and I think that's perhaps seems at first glance to be a hyperbolic framing of the situation, but at the same time, we could see separate spheres, so to speak, in terms of where US and Chinese tech companies respectively operate and what their different comparative advantages are in developed versus developing markets.
I'll just say briefly, I guess, I actually see a divergence in between the most interesting applications of this kind of technology and the most impactful ones. So the most interesting ones to talk about are things like, you know, at the cutting edge of combat and autonomous weapons, making decisions about who to kill, and there's all these interesting sort of legal and ethical problems. But I think that's probably not nearly as impactful on how militaries fight as things like AI and logistics. Like, that's actually the bulk of what militaries do. It's not, I mean, fighting is the ultimate end, but most of what the military is doing is like moving people and things from one place to another place. And so if you could use AI for things like, you know, optimizing logistics, doing predictive maintenance, so you could repair things right before they broke down, that would have probably much bigger long-term implications in terms of your readiness and ability to fight, I would think, in the big picture.
I think we'll open up the questions from the group. Mr. Brooks.
You just mentioned network smart cities, the notion of having an entire city where everything is networked, everything's centralized. What do you see that in relation to the future of urban warfare?
Should we take a couple questions? Or?
We'll start with that one because that seems like it can be a big question.
Sure, that is a great question. I'm not sure if I have a great answer because I think a lot of these projects are still at fairly nascent stages, and I'm more familiar with some of what China's undertaking in that context. And for the Chinese government, the development of smart cities is both seen as a way of fostering more sustainable and livable urbanization, but also as linked to thinking on social control and governance and how do you manage urban populations. And of course, there could be real material benefits to this approach, including better delivery of services and cities that are quite a bit more appealing to the average citizen. But I think that the potential for control and for greater surveillance, a greater ability to kind of manage day-to-day life of average citizens in ways that could become quite invasive is definitely a consideration on the part of the Chinese government as well, it seems. And in terms of the future of urban warfare, I'd imagine that if you're fighting in a smart city, the ability to hack or exploit the different devices and the infrastructure could be an advantage offensively, depending on whether that city is built with security in mind or how resilient that infrastructure is. So there could be more dependencies, more vulnerabilities, more ways of exploiting that urban infrastructure, including to monitor and surveil people through turning these systems against them, as from the perspective of an assault, defensively perhaps, could be a much more hostile environment in which to operate. So for instance, I mean, today in China, a couple of reporters have demonstrated, and people in their day-to-day lives are realizing that, it's hard to hide when there are surveillance cameras enabled with facial recognition increasingly that are deployed quite pervasively. It's hard to escape detection, whether you're a reporter or potentially undertaking more covert activities in different contexts. So I think the implications for human rights or for counterespionage are not insignificant there, as these technologies do become, quite extensive in their reach, and I'd imagine that could potentially defensively provide some advantages as well if you're a defender trying to have a very granular understanding of people who are trying to infiltrate or assault. So definitely a lot of interesting dynamics there, and I guess we'll find out in the decades to come how this plays out in actuality.
Yeah, your question makes me think a little bit about the different security impacts that emerge depending on which information architecture you choose for your smart city. So just to lay out a few of them, right? So one of them could be the smart city contains lots of devices that actually store what they see on the device itself, right? Individually. Another one could be all these sensors are hooked up to a central system. That system is kept down at City Hall, right? And a final one could be like the cloud smart city, right? There's all these sensors, but they actually are, all the data that's collected is stored completely somewhere else, right? Each of those choices has really distinct impacts in terms of how you might attack a smart city, right? And whether or not the compromise of a server actually allows your adversary to have access to all the data coming from a city or even just part of it, right? And so I think there's these really interesting questions of the smart city and its architecture that has these big implications.
The machines are taking over already.
Yeah. So maybe a quick response to that question.
I'm a science fiction fan and a science fiction writer, and it would be kind of fun to see what would happen if a city using a cloud-based system was served with a term of service violation as a way to pressure it into doing something that they didn't necessarily want you to do. There's a lot of potential there for misuse.
I guess two things immediately come to mind. One is a degree of transparency on the battlefield that I'm not sure that we're prepared for, that I think is, in some ways, it's here with existing network technology. It's like 2/3 of the global population are now mobile phone users, which comes with that, the ability of people to report on the location and disposition of our forces in real time. I saw, I was an NCO in the Army, I saw a lot of incidents on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan where I shudder to think of the strategic consequences if people had a cell phone there. And we've seen like cell phones dramatically transform debates around the use of force in policing in America. And I do not think we're ready in the military for what that means for our own forces. I don't think that we've trained it's got to dramatically change how we train our forces. So that's, I think, one problem. The other one that smart cities makes me think of is that increased efficiency would lead to more brittleness and a lack of resiliency. That a lot of times, as we've moved towards more efficient operations, more just-in-time delivery of services, of food, of fuel, of other things, that could mean that in a conflict environment, you have less actual resources and resiliency at your disposal in the city itself.
Take a couple questions back there, and next after that.
So I'm sensing a hint of skepticism of some of the big think books out there and articles on AI, and I'm thinking of Kai-Fu Lee. You guys have mentioned this, and I'm trying to take it personal that you guys are debunking his quote about Saudi Arabia holding a monopoly on big data and oil. But wondering about if you can, this kind of sky is falling, the end of the Enlightenment, as Kissinger put it in his article, in his Atlantic piece, debunk that. Why are they being overly negative, overly panicked, and why but is this just to sell books and and copies of the Atlantic, or is this actually something that we should be, these are big thinkers, and why shouldn't we take them more credibly?
Sure, I'm happy to jump into that. Yeah, I think a lot of it, so AI, just as a meta point, has proven to be a great fuel for thought leadership, in part because it's a great way for sort of players to have a legacy project, right? What better to end your career than working on AI, right? And I think that drives a lot of opinions in the space that are actually completely divorced from the technology itself. You know, and in many cases, AI just ends up being an excuse to talk about things that we would gripe about in other contexts, right? And so just to give you two examples of that from the Kissinger article, just to show that I'm not similarly just opining against, you know, the Kissinger article. So one of the things he talks about is a little bit like, he says that AI finds its own purposes, right? That actually is not true at all, right? Like ultimately machine learning is just really good statistics, right? And so it basically optimizes for the goal that we point it towards, right? It doesn't find new goals, right? Like the AlphaGo system is not gonna wake up tomorrow and say, my real passion in life is to become a writer. You know, it's not that, the systems don't work like that, right? A second argument that Kissinger makes is it causes us to rely too much on, you know, the outputs of the machine. We don't inquire anymore into what the technology, how the technology works and how a decision was made. But like that's arguably an argument that applies to the last like century plus of technology, right? And so I think on both counts, right? Like I think there's a tendency to overhype what this technology can do, both for good or for ill. And I think there's also like a complicity on the part of the media in reporting on it, because a lot of what AI does is stuff like, well, you can really recognize a cow in an image way better than it used to be, right? And that just doesn't make for as compelling of a story as like Terminator head, you know, Elon Musk says the world's gonna end, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think with any of these kinds of technology, whether it's AI or cyber or quantum or something, like you have to be able to, I agree with what Tim said, you have to be able to understand how the technology actually functions and deal with that, because it's easy otherwise for it to sound like magic, and then you can apply it to any sort of problem. Without specifically, I don't remember the Kissinger article well enough to refute it point by point.
I got beef, I don't know.
I remember I'm not liking it at the time, but I didn't like keep all that there. But I guess I'll tell you the things that worry me. I do think that technology is over the long term likely to be quite transformative. It seems to me that a lot of the, you know, in the near term, the things that I'm very concerned about are things like our ability to manage the impact on the economy, and not so much the idea that we're gonna have like 30% unemployment. I don't see predictions, like realistic analysis of what this does to the economy doesn't seem to predict that. It does look like it might increase income inequality in ways that could certainly be problematic for democracies, and I think that's a problem. I worry about this being used by authoritarian regimes. I take Kai-Fu Liu is an interesting book about the role of China. I take China's investments in AI quite seriously. I take their intention to be the global leader by 2030 quite seriously. I'm quite concerned, though, about the uses to which China would put this technology domestically and abroad. And so I think that, like, you know, there's this broader struggle of like, how do we use these technologies, whether it's AI and other things, and are they going to be forces for authoritarianism or for more freedom and openness? And even when the technology is democratizing, it of course doesn't mean it leads to good outcomes, right? Social media is incredibly democratizing, and it's not clear that it's been good for democracy. So I think those are like the challenges that really worry me, at least in the near term.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what China intends to do with AI, including to enhance the regime's coercive capability and bolster legitimacy, does raise concerns for me about the implications for the future of democratic governance, given that that model can be and is starting to be exported around the world. And censorship and surveillance and internet management in China is not new, but I think AI does make that potentially more adaptive and more scalable in ways that are new. Plus, I think I'd be remiss not to mention ways in which the Chinese government is starting to experiment with technologies like biometrics, facial recognition, natural language processing, and the like, and what it's doing in Xinjiang today, where hundreds of thousands, by some estimates, or higher, Uyghurs, a Muslim minority, have been incarcerated and detained in what are increasingly characterized as concentration camps. So I think that and I think that the ability to leverage these technologies in those quite concerning applications, given the lack of safeguards here, is hard to ignore when we're looking at potential trajectories here. I think to the general concern about the future of AI and the future of the world. I think there has been a lot of hyperbolic thinking, and I think the risks are real, though they may not be quite as existential as some may fear, at least not in the near term. I think some of these subtler risks in terms of bias, in terms of brittleness, and errors in these technologies are quite concerning, especially when you think about how some of these issues could play out in a military context. And I think I've continued to try to debunk the notion of an AI arms race insofar as I think that's a incomplete framing of a very complex technology that has many more applications. But I do think we may be seeing what I would characterize as more of an AI security dilemma, that insofar as there is military competition extending into these technologies, and there's inherent uncertainty about each other's capabilities on the part of militaries, given this is so hard to measure and evaluate, there could be a tendency towards arms racing dynamics in the context of a broader military competition that does raise some concerning questions about the impact on the future of military stability, perhaps even strategic stability, as we're seeing a new era of great power rivalry, so to speak. So I think there are some real reasons for concern, but I think hopefully we can continue to move beyond the more magical thinking and look at a lot of the very real issues at stake in military affairs, for human rights and democracy and otherwise.
Yeah, to build on that theme, maybe a final gloss on the question of China. I think in a lot of these discussions, there's sort of an unspoken strategic question in my mind, which is sort of, does the US need to Chinify in order to win the machine learning or AI game, right? And there's a notion that, well, you know, they have the data, right? So surely they will be able to prevail on AI. And I kind of want to just take a quick moment to counter that argument, right? And actually to say that machine learning is actually an actively evolving field. And I think one of the really interesting things in the space is to think about how military investments could actually change the assumptions that we bring to what it means to compete on AI, right? So I'll give you two quick examples. One of them is there's a nascent sort of subfield within machine learning, which is the sort of field of studying one-shot learning, right? The idea is, can you make a machine learning system that works really well with a much smaller amount of data, right? You can imagine if you actually crack certain technical problems in that space, suddenly the fact that, you know, data is less accessible due to privacy laws may not actually be as big of a challenge in competing and designing sort of AI systems that can perform at parity, right? Another one is a technique that's known as federated learning, right? Sort of the notion that in the future, sort of you'll keep your personal data on the device, and only small updates to the AI system will be transmitted up into the cloud, right? So it's possible to create these AI systems where you don't actually need to store all the personal data in one place, right? And these systems actually...
Want to move on to a couple more
Okay,
questions?
sure. Yeah, just to at least say that, like, I think that, like, machine learning is actually a lot more malleable than we give it credit for. And this is actually still a time when we can actually shift these to compete actually in ways that don't necessarily require us to follow a Chinese model.
Dr. Sander?
So I think we talk a lot about the algorithms behind AI, but increasingly I'm interested in whether the long pole behind all this is actually like getting all the data. And especially when we're talking about a competition between US and Chinese militaries. I'm interested, because I think all of you have looked at this in some ways, what you see as kind of the balance of competition there between each military, the Chinese military and the American military's ability to collect data, consolidate data, and then use that data for AI applications.
So I guess one observation I'd make, and see what Tim and Elsa to say, but is that whether it's data or computing power or human capital, sort of whether different components, one of the things that concerns me is the tighter integration that you see in China between the private sector and the military. Whereas you have, of course, some companies like Google pushing back against working with the military here. And even if you get over those cultural things, you have an issue here in the United States where, you know, the companies that are at the forefront of this technology are just not traditional defense companies. There are companies that are not used to working with the Defense Department, and so there are both cultural barriers and then huge sort of like logistics barriers in terms of the acquisition system, which is, you know, is so awkward and cumbersome that you basically have to specialize in working with the Defense Department to be viable to work with them. And we made it that difficult, and so we've created sort of these giant barriers to innovation that we built inside the U.S. Defense Department that now make it hard for companies to work with us. And you've got people at DIUX and at DIU trying to break that down, but you know, what's the ability of DoD to scale that up in a big fashion? I don't know without it becoming more bureaucratized. those seem to me like huge bureaucratic obstacles to getting the data, getting also people and computing power and other aspects of the technology.
Yeah, I think that there may be some common challenges among militaries here that are inherent in the nature of bureaucracy. So, for instance, folks from the Chinese defense industry have complained that for them, managing defense big data, for instance, in aviation and aerospace, is also challenging because it may be scattered across different research institutes, military units, and companies, and it can be hard to bring together and to start to manage and fully leverage that data. Again, I think challenges not dissimilar to those the U.S. military and defense industry are grappling with in terms of how best to have the right data and be able to employ it appropriately. I think China's focus on military civil fusion, or this seeking of a greater merging of defense and private sector efforts, could be impactful going forward. And I think it is at a nascent stage as a strategy and agenda that in some cases draws upon aspects of the US model that have been successful. So for instance, there's what I would characterize as a DIUX imitator of sorts, a small team intended at spurring rapid innovation and helping the Chinese military leverage commercial technologies based in Shenzhen. So I think it's really an open question and challenge for four different military organizations, the US and China alike, and I think it's, at least based on what I've seen so far, it's hard to tell which of them is handling these very practical issues better, whether it is these issues of data management or how to build up the appropriate infrastructure, including a transition to cloud computing in this context. So I think that'll be a main indicator to watch going forward.
Yeah, I think
we have a diminishing
yeah,
amount of
sorry,
time.
but I actually would just like to get in on this question because I'm sort of a coder by training, so I'm going to give a much nerdier answer, which maybe goes to this question of data, right? Data is the sort of the blunt tool in the machine learning space, right? Most of what we know about machine learning systems is if you want to train a system to recognize cats in an image, you need lots of data, right? But there's actually a number of other things that change the amount of data that you actually need, right? So machine learning systems require what's known as a learning architecture, right? Which is the algorithm that actually improves as you get more data, right? And one of the interesting techniques that people are using right now is something called meta-learning. And the end result of this is basically that you have learning architectures that are much more efficient than the ones that we have been designing. And what's efficiency mean? It means that you can actually train these systems using less data, right? So there's actually a bunch of components to the machine learning process that trade off against how much data you need in order to pull off designing one of these systems. And so, I think that the rawest form of competition is we just need more data than them, but there's actually a lot of things that can be done to reduce that reliance and in ways that actually may be a place of competitive advantage.
I think we are going to have to go with our closing statements. Sorry, we've started just a couple more minutes left, so we want to go through it briefly.
Well, I'd be happy to take another question or two instead, then we could just respond.
Oh, we can do that too.
Yeah, I don't want to.
Run out the clock.
I'm a Navy Surface Warfare officer, so I see a little bit of a thinking and doing gap in DoD when it comes to AI. We talk about how it's going to impact the future of warfare, but not about the policies to actually kind of bring ML throughout the enterprise. Tim, I really appreciated how you talked about the need for specificity. If any of you could talk to a few concrete policy recommendations you would make to DoD leaders or US government leaders on how do we pave the way for these inputs to actually be used, whether it's data, compute, talent, or the architectures. Thank you.
Great question. I think a lot of strategic challenges there that both the US military and the Chinese military are grappling with as they think about how best to leverage these technologies going forward. For the Chinese military, they're focused on what they characterize as an intelligentization of trying to advance AI-enabled technologies and capabilities for all relevant contexts. And one of the things that China is looking to do in particular, and I think something that I hope the US will pursue more actively as well going forward, is focusing on talent as a strategic resource. So in the case of China, a lot of educational undertakings underway, from partnerships between the public and private sector aimed at training engineers and more rapidly to establishing AI as a first-level major in the Chinese education system and rapidly expanding programs at universities, which can also start to create more of a pipeline that the military can draw upon as well. So I think talent is foundational here, and perhaps the real arms race in this context, so to speak. And I think I'll So I just wanted to highlight that in particular, and I will leave the other recommendations to my esteemed colleagues here.
Okay, sure, yeah. We have a report come out this summer at the Center for American Security on this, so I'll just give you a couple highlights on some specific things. One, I'd like to see Congress fund the Joint AI Center. Misfunding in this last round, hopefully likely to get a reprogramming this year. I think that's key in terms of getting it off the ground. I think the DoD could do more to adjust some of their acquisition systems, whether it's using other transactional authority or organizations like DIU, to interface better with startups, educate people in DoD who are doing some of these about like how the startup life cycle works and how the ecosystem is and where they would inject in a useful way. One of the things I've heard back from numerous examples of people at startup companies or at venture capital firms is that like DoD is a nightmare to work with in this front. The DoD will basically string you along for years, giving you a bunch of requirements, and then show up like late to the game, if ever, with any kind of capital or return on investment. And I've heard from like people at VC firms, they're like, yeah, I won't let my companies work with DoD. And I've heard from a number of entrepreneurs that they're like, it's good for branding, it's good for marketing to say like, oh, I have a defense client, I have a defense kind of use, but it's not actually helpful in growing the business beyond that, not in the near term. I think that it would very much behoove DoD to be a little bit smarter about the public messaging about this technology. I don't think that we're helping ourselves the way that we talk about it publicly in terms of the cultural divide with Silicon Valley. I'd like to see DoD publish some sort of public AI ethics principles or strategy or something that responds to the concerns that people have about how militaries might use the technology. I think they should get their act together on messaging, that we should stop having people use the term lethality when it refers to this technology. It's not helping. I get that it's like really cool messaging up the chain to the Secretary of Defense, but when you have people in DoD who are in charge of cloud computing say things like, the cloud is lethal, one, it's nonsense, it's not lethal. Like, we're not dropping cloud computers on people's heads, but it's super unhelpful, right? We're trying to get people from like Microsoft and Amazon and Google to work with us. Really, I think, counterproductive. U.S. government-wide, actually, DoD is further ahead than most places in the government. There's some efforts underway on AI R&D to try to get a handle on this. The White House has some efforts underway internally. I think we need a major plus up in spending. It's hard to know how much because the government can't tell you right now how much we are spending. If you ask the White House, how much are we spending right now on R&D, they can say, well, AI is a priority for us. Like, but how much are we spending? They're like, we don't know. We're working on it. We're trying to add it up. So I think we should track it. We should increase spending. We should focus attention on places where we think the private sector might not spend, like places like AI safety. I'd like to see us really think strategically about STEM education. How do we make sure that we're growing the right people nationally? And then I think that where this administration has gone in terms of immigration policy is disastrous for our ability to bring in talent abroad. And we've seen a drop-off in the last 2 years in foreign students coming to the United States. There are obviously, I think, some very significant concerns when it comes to Chinese students coming from abroad and going back to China, stealing intellectual property or using this as sort of a form of academic kind of industrial espionage. But more broadly, for a long time, we've been able to bring sort of top-tier talent from around the globe, have people come to the United States, study here, and then many of them stay here and found companies, and we're giving up a precious national resource. And the White House is actively encouraging that right now, rather than fighting against. I think that's very troubling.
Tim, you get the last word.
Sure, yeah, that's a very comprehensive list. So I agree with much of what's been said. I mean, I think I would additionally highlight, right, certainly the acquisition and procurement piece, I think is incredible, particularly as sort of the initial group of talent in machine learning, which was concentrated in a small number of companies, increasingly disperses to a smaller number of like startups and kind of specialized companies on this stuff. It feels like there's a huge missed opportunity if you can't actually take advantage of that general trend in the labor market around this stuff. I think to go to a point that I mentioned earlier, I think there is an important need to fund sort of a technical agenda that overcomes sort of limitations we think the US will have in AI in the mid to long term, right? So that's things like, can we create breakthroughs that allow AI systems to be trained with less data, for instance, right? Can we create more efficient learning architectures? Some of it gets very wonky very quickly, but I think there's actually a very specific technical agenda
to guide investment on, how do we want to shape machine learning so we actually can compete at parity in the space.
Okay, that'll do it, I think. Thank you very much for coming out.
Thanks.